All right, so let's jump into a topic that I think can cause a few headaches when you're setting up your Proxmox cluster.
Oh, yeah,
And that is picking the right storage solution.
for sure.
Especially for a cluster of, say, 3 to 5 nodes, this is a decision that can really impact how smoothly things run.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. Storage is really the foundation of any virtualization platform.
Yeah,
And with Proxmox, you've got some interesting choices to make.
and that's what we're here for, right? I've got a whole stack of articles and research here on this very topic, and I'm really curious to see how this breaks down, especially for a cluster like yours.
Yeah.
We'll be looking at everything from Ceph, ZFS, good old NFS, and iSCSI, even some newer stuff like Blockbridge. And of course,
Wow.
we can't forget those sort of pre-built systems like Synology.
Yeah, it's fascinating. There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
Each option kind of comes with its own quirks and trade-offs.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. First up, we've got Ceph. Now, I've heard a lot about Ceph, this being this just, super scalable, super redundant solution, which sounds amazing.
hmm
But is it really the best fit for every Proxmox cluster, especially a smaller one?
That's a great question. You see, Ceph's power really lies in its distributed nature.
Okay.
It spreads the data across multiple nodes.
Mm-hmm.
So even if one node fails, you're still good to go.
Oh, okay.
But that also means that you need at least 3 nodes for it to really work properly.
Okay, so for a 3 to 5 node cluster, we're kind of right at the edge of where Ceph starts to make sense.
Exactly. And we have to consider the complexity factor as well.
Yeah.
Ceph requires you to kind of configure multiple components like monitors and OSDs, which
Well,
are basically the brains and the storage units of the system.
yeah.
And in a small cluster, managing all of that might be more trouble than it's worth, especially if you're not a storage expert.
So Ceph, great for those massive enterprise level deployments. Maybe not the most practical choice for someone just starting out with Proxmox.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have ZFS.
Okay.
ZFS is famous for its data integrity features.
Mm.
Think of it like a bank vault for your data.
Yeah. ZFS has this reputation for being rock solid,
Absolutely.
especially with its copy on write and checksumming features.
That's right.
It's like it's constantly checking itself, making sure your data is safe and sound.
That's right. And it's surprisingly easy to set up, especially on a smaller scale.
Oh,
But
oh,
but
yeah.
here's the thing. ZFS can be a bit of a resource hog,
Okay.
particularly when it comes to RAM.
So you need to make sure you've got enough horsepower under the hood to run this smoothly. How much RAM are we talking about here?
Well, for a basic ZFS setup, you're looking at around 8 gigabytes of RAM per node.
Okay.
But as your storage needs grow, so does the RAM requirement. You could easily end up needing 16 gigabytes or more per node,
Wow.
which might be a constraint for some folks with a limited budget.
So ZFS, super reliable, but it comes at the cost of needing more resources, especially RAM. Is there kind of a sweet spot for ZFS in terms of cluster size?
The sweet spot for ZFS really is a 2-node setup,
Okay.
where you're getting that rock-solid data integrity without needing a ton of resources.
Mm-hmm.
But for 3 to 5 nodes,
Yeah,
you might want to consider whether those resources could be better utilized elsewhere.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So Ceph might be overkill. ZFS might be a bit too resource hungry for this scenario. What about something like NFS? It's been around forever and it seems pretty straightforward.
NFS is definitely the go-to option for simplicity.
Okay.
It's like that trusty old pickup truck, it might not be flashy,
Yeah.
but it gets the job done. It's super easy to set up, and pretty much any system can act as an NFS server.
So if you're just looking for a very basic shared storage solution, no bells and whistles, NFS could be a good starting point.
Exactly. But keep in mind that simplicity comes with trade-offs.
Oh.
NFS doesn't offer advanced features like built-in redundancy or high availability.
Yeah.
If your NFS server goes down, your entire storage goes down with it.
Oh, that's a pretty big consideration, especially if you're running critical applications on your Proxmox cluster.
It is.
It's like putting all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah, and it's another factor to consider. Performance, NFS relies on network communication,
Right.
which can introduce latency, especially if you're dealing with lots of small file transfers.
So if you're running applications that need super fast access to storage, NFS might not be the best fit.
Probably not.
But if you're mostly dealing with larger files and speed isn't your top priority, it could still be a viable option.
Right. It all comes down to your specific needs and what you're willing to compromise on.
Okay, so we've covered the Ceph ZFS and NFS. Let's move on to iSCSI.
Okay.
Now, iSCSI is often touted as a high-performance option, right?
It is.
What makes it so different from
And
NFS?
one of the key differences is that iSCSI operates at the block level,
Okay.
while NFS works with files. Think of it this way: with NFS, you're sending entire files over the network, while with iSCSI, you're sending smaller blocks of data,
Oh, okay.
which can be much faster,
Hmm.
especially for applications that require random access to data.
So if I'm running something like a database on my Proxmox cluster, iSCSI would give me that speed advantage that I need.
Exactly. And iSCSI also supports a feature called multipath I/O,
Okay.
which allows you to connect to your storage through multiple network paths.
Right.
This not only boosts performance, but also provides redundancy.
Oh, nice.
If one network connection fails, you still have others to keep things running.
That's a huge plus, especially for high availability scenarios.
It is.
It's like having backup routes for your data traffic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there is one downside to iSCSI.
Uh-oh.
It doesn't natively support snapshots.
Right.
Snapshots are like taking a picture of your data at a specific point in time,
Mm-hmm.
which can be super useful for backups and disaster recovery.
Okay, so if I'm using iSCSI, I might need to rely on third-party tools or Proxmox features to handle snapshots, which could add a bit of complexity to my setup.
That's a valid point. Now, before we move on to the newer options,
Mm-hmm.
have you ever considered using a pre-built system,
Mhm.
like a Synology NAS, for your Proxmox storage?
I have, actually. They seem incredibly convenient, especially with their user-friendly interfaces.
Yeah.
I'm always a little wary of vendor lock-in, though.
That's a legitimate concern.
Yeah.
Synology NAS devices can be a great option if you're looking for an all-in-one solution that's easy to manage.
Right.
They often come with their own software for things like backups and snapshots, which can simplify your workflow.
Yeah. And they typically support multiple storage protocols, including NFS and iSCSI, so you have some flexibility there.
You do.
But the trade-off is that you're tied to their ecosystem.
Exactly. And while they might be more convenient up front,
Yeah.
they can also be more expensive than building your own storage solution using something
Yeah.
like ZFS or NFS.
Okay, so it seems like there's always a trade-off, no matter which way you go so far. We've covered Ceph, ZFS, NFS, iSCSI, and even touched on pre-built systems like Synology. What other options are out there for Proxmox storage, especially for someone with, say, a 3 to 5 node cluster?
Well, there's one more we should definitely discuss, and that's Blockbridge.
Okay, Blockbridge. I've heard that name. It's supposed to be pretty cutting edge, right? What makes it stand out from the crowd?
Blockbridge is all about combining the performance of iSCSI
Okay.
with advanced features like deduplication and compression.
Deduplication and compression. That sounds intriguing. How does that work exactly, and how does it benefit a Proxmox user?
Imagine you have multiple virtual machines on your Proxmox cluster, and they all have the same operating system installed.
Okay.
Traditionally, each virtual machine would have its own copy of that operating system, taking up valuable storage space with deduplication. Blockbridge identifies those duplicate blocks of data
Oh.
and stores only one copy, freeing up a ton of space.
So if I'm running a lot of virtual machines with similar content, Blockbridge could potentially save me a significant amount of storage space.
Absolutely. And compression takes us a step further by shrinking the size of the data that's stored,
Wow.
which can further improve storage efficiency.
This all sounds really impressive, but Blockbridge is still relatively new, right? Are there any drawbacks or things to be cautious about?
Well, that's the thing about newer technologies.
Yeah.
They might not have the same level of community support or the extensive knowledge base
Right.
of more established options.
So if I run into a problem with Blockbridge, I might not find as much information online or get as much help from the community
Yeah, it could be.
compared to something like ZFS or NFS.
It's possible. And there's the cost factor to consider as well.
Huh.
Blockbridge might require specific hardware or licensing,
Oh.
which could add to the overall cost of your Proxmox setup.
So Blockbridge offers some really cool features, but it's important to weigh those against the potential downsides of it being a newer technology. It's almost like taking a calculated risk.
Exactly.
Right.
And that brings us to the end of this part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the scalability of Ceph to the simplicity of NFS, the data integrity of ZFS, the performance of iSCSI, and even the potential of Blockbridge. But the real question is, which one is the right fit for your specific needs?
Well, that's what we'll be exploring in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
We will.
We'll dive deeper into those key decision factors, things like performance requirements, budget constraints, and how much effort you're really willing to put into managing your storage.
Absolutely.
So stay tuned for that.
We'll be right back.
Welcome back to our Proxmox storage deep dive. We just laid out a whole bunch of different storage options, each with its own little quirks and strengths.
Right. And now it's all about, figuring out which one fits your needs the best.
Right.
We got to think about things like how much performance you need, your budget, even how comfortable you are with tinkering under the hood.
Okay, so let's start with performance. If I'm running applications that need to access data super fast, like databases or virtual machines with really heavy workloads, what are my best
In
options?
those cases, iSCSI often comes out on top.
Okay.
It operates at the block level, meaning it sends smaller chunks of data, making it much faster for applications that need random access.
Okay.
And with multipath I/O, you can have multiple network paths.
Right.
So you're not only boosting performance, but you're adding redundancy.
Oh, nice.
It's like having backup highways for your data.
I like that.
Yeah.
So if speed is the top priority, iSCSI is a strong contender, but what if I'm more concerned about data integrity? Making absolutely sure that my data is safe from corruption.
Then ZFS should be at the top of your list.
Okay.
It's built with a level of redundancy that makes data corruption extremely unlikely.
Wow.
ZFS uses checksumming to constantly verify the integrity of your data.
Okay.
Think of it as having a built-in fact checker for every piece of data you store.
That's pretty reassuring.
Yeah, especially if you're dealing with sensitive information or mission-critical applications.
Right, but we talked earlier about ZFS being a bit resource intensive. How does that play into the performance equation?
It's a balancing act. While ZFS excels at data integrity,
Right.
it does require more resources, particularly RAM, to operate efficiently.
Okay.
If your hardware is limited, ZFS's performance might be impacted.
So for someone with a 3 to 5 node cluster, it's a trade-off between ZFS's rock-solid reliability and its potential performance impact.
Exactly. Now let's flip the script and talk about ease of use.
Okay.
Some folks just want a storage solution that's simple to set up and manage without needing a degree in computer science.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. Sometimes you just want something that works
Exactly.
without having to spend hours tweaking configurations.
Right.
So what would you recommend for those who prioritize simplicity?
NFS is your best friend in that scenario.
Okay.
It's straightforward, easy to configure, and widely compatible. You don't need any specialized hardware or software. Almost any system can act as an NFS server.
So it sounds like the perfect plug-and-play solution for Proxmox storage.
It can be.
But we did mention that NFS has some limitations, particularly when it comes to redundancy and high availability.
That's right. NFS relies on a single server. So if that server goes down, your entire storage goes offline.
Right, like a single point of failure?
It's like having a single key to your house. If you lose it, you're locked out.
Makes sense. So NFS great for simplicity, but not ideal for mission-critical applications where uptime is absolutely paramount.
Right.
What about cost? Budget is always a big factor when setting up any kind of infrastructure.
Absolutely. And that's where NFS shines again. It's very cost effective.
Yeah.
Especially when compared to more complex solutions like Ceph or those pre-built systems we talked about. You can use existing hardware.
Right.
And there are no expensive licenses to worry about.
So for budget-conscious users, NFS seems like a no-brainer.
It can be.
But what if you're willing to spend a bit more to get those advanced features like deduplication and compression that we discussed earlier?
Then Blockbridge becomes a very interesting contender.
Okay.
It aims to offer the best of both worlds, the performance of iSCSI with the space-saving benefits of deduplication and compression.
That's a very appealing combination, especially if you're working with a limited storage budget.
It is. It's like getting a high-performance sports car that also happens to be incredibly fuel efficient.
I like it, but Blockbridge is still relatively new, right? Does that raise any concerns?
It's a valid point.
Yeah.
Well, Blockbridge has a lot of potential.
Yeah.
It's important to consider the maturity of the technology. It might not have the same level of community support or the extensive documentation of more established solutions.
Yeah, if you run into a problem, you might not have as much, information out there to help you figure it out.
Right. It's like venturing off the beaten path. You might discover some amazing things, but you also might not have as much guidance if you get lost.
So for someone who really values stability and a proven track record, sticking with a more mature solution like ZFS or iSCSI might be the safer bet.
Exactly. But for those who are willing to embrace newer technologies and potentially reap the benefits of their innovation, Blockbridge is definitely worth exploring. It all comes down to your risk tolerance and how comfortable you are being an early adopter.
Yeah, like an early adopter tax almost.
Kinda, yeah.
All right, so we've talked about performance, ease of use cost, and even the maturity of the technology. There's one more factor that I think is crucial, especially when you're thinking long term, and that is scalability.
Okay.
What if my storage needs grow significantly in the future?
That's where Ceph really shines.
Okay.
It's designed to scale horizontally, meaning you can easily add more nodes to your cluster as your storage needs increase.
Oh, okay, so it can grow with you.
That's like having a storage system made of Lego blocks. You can keep adding more blocks as your collection grows.
So if I anticipate needing a lot more storage down the road, Ceph would be a good investment, even if it's a bit overkill for my current 3 to 5 node setup.
That's a smart approach by choosing Ceph early on. You're essentially future-proofing your storage infrastructure. But remember, with scalability comes complexity.
Right. We talked earlier about Ceph requiring more expertise to set up and manage.
Exactly. It's not exactly a set it and forget it kind of solution.
No, it sounds like it needs a little bit of love.
A little bit, yeah.
So if you're not comfortable with the technical intricacies of Ceph, it might be wise to start with a simpler solution like NFS or ZFS, and then migrate to Ceph later on as your needs evolve.
That's a great point. It's like choosing the right size of house.
Yeah.
You wouldn't buy a mansion if you're just starting a family, but you might consider it if you plan on having a lot more kids down the road.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it now. Before we move on, let's circle back to those pre-built systems like Synology.
Okay.
They can be tempting for their convenience,
They can.
but I think there are some important trade-offs to consider. I'm always a bit hesitant about vendor lock-in.
That's a valid concern. When you choose a pre-built system, you're essentially committing to that vendor's ecosystem,
Right.
which could limit your options in the future. It's like choosing a phone with a proprietary charger.
Right.
You're stuck using their accessories, even if better options become available.
Yeah, you're at their mercy.
Pretty much. And we also talked about the cost factor. Pre-built systems can be more expensive than building your own storage solution, especially if you're comfortable with a bit of DIY.
So, while pre-built systems offer convenience, it's important to weigh those factors carefully. If you're looking for flexibility and control over your storage environment, a DIY approach might be a better long-term strategy.
I think so.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here: performance, ease of use, cost, scalability, even the trade-offs of pre-built systems. But at the end of the day, choosing the right storage solution for your Proxmox cluster is a personal decision.
It is. It's all about finding the right balance for your specific needs and priorities.
Right.
There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Well said, but I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about. In the final part of our episode, we'll bring it all together and recap the key takeaways.
Sound good.
We'll also leave you with some thought-provoking questions to consider as you navigate the ever-evolving world of Proxmox storage, so stay tuned for that. Okay, so we've made it to the final part of our Proxmox storage deep dive, and I feel like we've covered so much ground.
We have.
We've gone from those real heavy hitters like Ceph to the simple workhorses like NFS, and even touched on some of the newcomers like Blockbridge.
It's been a whirlwind.
It really has, and it's kind of amazing to me how many different options there are out there and how each one really seems to cater to a different set of needs.
Absolutely.
So as we kind of wrap things up here for our listeners who have been with us on this journey, what are some of the key takeaways, the big aha moments that they should really remember when they're going through this process of picking the right storage solution for their Proxmox cluster?
I think the biggest takeaway, and we've said it a few times, but it's worth repeating,
Yeah.
there's no magic bullet.
Right.
There's no single storage solution that is perfect for every situation.
Right. The perfect unicorn.
Exactly. It doesn't exist.
It just doesn't.
So, it really is about understanding those trade-offs that we've been talking about and really carefully considering which option aligns best with your priorities.
Right. It's like that whole idea of choosing the right tool for the job.
Exactly.
If you need raw speed and you've got the resources to handle it, iSCSI might be your best bet.
Mm-hmm.
But if simplicity and cost effectiveness are more important, NFS could be a great option.
Exactly.
And of course, we can't forget about data integrity for those mission critical applications.
Right. If your data is absolutely essential, you need to make sure it's protected. And ZFS, with all of its, checksumming and the redundancy features, that can really give you that peace of mind, even if it means dedicating a bit more RAM.
Yeah, maybe spending a little bit more.
A little bit, yeah.
But for some people, that's worth it.
Absolutely. And thinking long term, Ceph, with its ability to just scale horizontally
Yeah.
as your needs grow, can be a really smart investment, even if it might be a little overkill for your current setup.
Right.
It's kind of like planting a tree.
I was going to say, you've got another analogy for us.
I do. It might be small now, but, it has that potential to really grow into something much larger and more robust in the future.
I love that. So we've got speed, simplicity, reliability, scalability, all represented by these different options. But how do you figure out which one is right for you?
Right. Well, there's a few questions you can ask yourself.
Yeah, what kind of questions should they be asking themselves?
Well, first and foremost, you got to define those performance requirements.
Okay.
What kind of applications are you running?
Right. What are you actually doing with this?
How much speed do you absolutely need?
Yeah, because if you're just running, a couple basic virtual machines or a file server, you might not need the blazing fast speeds of iSCSI.
Exactly.
Yeah,
NFS might be perfectly fine.
totally. And then there's always that budget factor. How much are you willing to spend on storage? NFS, again, very budget friendly. Some of these other solutions like Ceph, you might have to invest a little bit more.
Yeah, and how comfortable are you with managing storage?
Yeah.
Are you comfortable with the command line, getting into the nitty-gritty details? Or do you prefer something that's a little bit more user-friendly, point and click?
Right. Do you want to get your hands dirty or do you want it to just work?
Exactly. And that's really going to influence your choice because, something like ZFS, while powerful, does require a bit more, hands-on management compared to NFS, which is known for its simplicity.
Right. And then the final thing to think about is scalability. Do you anticipate your storage needs growing significantly, in the next year or two? If so, choosing something like Ceph that can handle that growth might save you some headaches later on.
Yeah, exactly. It's like choosing the right size suitcase for a trip.
Oh,
Here.
you've got another one.
I do.
Mm.
If you're just going away for a weekend, a small carry-on might be all you need. But if you're planning a month-long adventure, you're going to need something a lot bigger.
A lot bigger and more versatile.
Exactly.
All right, so we've armed our listeners with, a ton of knowledge about Proxmox storage.
I hope so.
But before we wrap things up, I want to leave them with something to ponder.
Okay.
We've seen how, technology is constantly evolving. We've got new storage solutions popping up, like Blockbridge. Existing ones like Ceph are always improving.
Yeah, always evolving.
So it really begs the question, how is this landscape going to evolve in the next few years?
Right. What's next?
What's next? Are we going to see even more innovative solutions emerge? Are these lines between these different options going to start to blur as they adopt features from each other?
It's hard to say, but it's exciting to think about.
It really is. And it's a great reminder that, this learning never really stops. You've got to stay curious. You've got to keep exploring and always be willing to adapt as new technologies, approaches emerge.
Absolutely well said.
Well, I think that just about wraps up our Proxmox storage deep dive.
I think so.
I hope you found it helpful. And remember, the best storage solution for you is the one that meets your specific needs and helps you get the most out of your Proxmox cluster.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.